when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Now that's a speech. Throughout history, the fight for justice and reclaiming power from those at the top has been an eternal pursuit as old as time. We know the story: a great power corrupts the land, tyranny rules, but strength in numbers will prevail. In this video, I'd like to explore the other side to protesting, the dark side, aka the idiot side. As famously seen by the I Have a Dream guy, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm P. Diddy X. Really good examples of men standing tall with meaning behind their voices and a deeper philosophy that governs their worldview. Or closer to modern era, the clash between the Egyptian people against the Hosni Mubarak government back in 2011. Legit, the citizens of Egypt overthrew the government, a true representation of the people versus the powerful. I think most people would recognize the vital importance of fighting against corruption. You know, sticking it to the man concept. But what happens if the great fight is not legitimate? If you replace Mr. Burger King's eloquent and powerful speeches with those of a spoilt brat loser, you get the modern-day protester. You know the type, no knowledge of history or understanding of reality, and has a need to manufacture trauma inside their safe and comfortable lives. Ladies and gentlebeans, you essentially get the ramblings of the mentally ill, but with the added spice of undeserved privileges they claim not to have. It's like replacing Batman with a neck-bearded incel or plus-size model. A regular put-together person would see there is something not quite right and not someone to aspire to be like. It's like replacing Michael Jordan with Aaron from accounting. No one would consider the sport legitimate anymore. Merit and talent are no longer considered. Kids are not going to be inspired to take up the ball to shoot some hoops. You've essentially killed the sport and the dreams of many. While those rambling from the spoilt and autistic are here to take away your fun with their unoriginal thoughts, parroting the same nonsense and talking points that have been debunked many times. Take the gender pay gap garbage. It is illegal to pay we men less than a man for the same work. No matter how many studies have debunked the narrative, people still believe in it. Plus, you know, why not sue the company if this thing is real? Basically, most differences in the gap comes from men working longer hours, doing harder jobs, or technical jobs that scale up, chase full-time positions over part-time. Men even ask for raises more often. Reminds me of when Google's attempted simping didn't work out. They wanted to ensure females were paid the same as males. But what they found was, in fact, the opposite. Men who weren't paid correctly, forcing the company to give a payday to the underpaid mini patriarchs found in the company. Speaking of raises, perhaps chicks want you to be a mind reader so they don't have to ask. Sound familiar, fellas? Let me say this once, there is no gap between like for like work. And hey, if anything, just maybe, and I really mean maybe, we men actually cost more for companies than men. We are just not allowed to say that. Hear me out. Men are more likely to stay back after work, more likely to not take time off, less likely to take advantage of work-life balance policies. The ladies can get pregnant at any time, creating a situation where the company must pay for their maternity leave. Men are less likely to take paternity leave, and usually if they do, it's for a shorter time if paternity leave is given in their particular country, that is. Oh, and not to mention, in larger companies, the constant female-only events to support and reward them also takes time away from their work. Geez, I wonder who's left behind doing the work during these events. Well, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it could be true that the ladies cost more overall than the average male. Now, of course, I'd only hire the best bean, no matter the gender. The best workers are usually worth their price tag. Let me tell you a quick story. I was working for this corporate company. My boss at the time was a workaholic. He'd work long hours and even worked on the weekends. He had deep knowledge of the field we were in and knew how to execute any project. He could be painful to deal with at times, but he did get results anyway. My boss got a promotion to run a different team and was replaced with this woman who had little to no knowledge of the space she has entered, was nice to your face but was passive-aggressive, had a focus on work-life balance, and spent a lot of time exercising the life part more than the work part. Let's just say she didn't last long, and she couldn't figure out why. I know the why. She took a role from a guy who works longer hours, including the weekend, understood the environment he was in with a proven track record at achieving his goals, and has made a name for himself. Then this lady comes in and is like, "Why did this happen to me? You're filling up some pretty hefty shoes there, love. You can't treat every work environment like a daycare, yo." With this knowledge, why didn't this new boss measure herself against the previous one? That is what any competent person would do, right? Nope. She has that loser mentality of whatever I do is brilliant, strong, and brave, and don't measure me with others. It's the same with these protesters. Where is the caliber of speeches as we have seen in the past? There is no poetry or profound message. These are people who speak like children and have the same level of understanding of one. Or they sound like me, actually. Just remember, the gender pay gap is a myth, and yet thousands of chicks go protesting on an issue that doesn't exist. Let's think about that for a second. They are protesting a lie. Out of their so called busy lives, they will sharpen their markers, write some unoriginal slogan on a cardboard sign, which, by the way, is not very good for the environment, and waste a day being a nuisance over a fake problem. I'm going to go out on a limb and say a lot of these we men are sexist. To collectively come together over a lie, I'm sorry, there must be a level of hatred in their hearts. Perhaps they are coming from the angle of being a victim to punish others for their own life choices and blame men for it. I mean, it's easier to blame men than to say, nah, I don't want to work full time, so I deserve less. Returning to my point, protesters sit in fairy tale land. Take Iceland. 100,000 chicklets went protesting for equality, taking the day off to prove how important they are. That is 20% of the country. And somehow the country continued. But here's the thing, society didn't grind to a halt. So either the ladies are not useful to the economy, which I really don't think that's the case, or more likely, the type of chick who would attend these rallies are overall useless and perhaps more of a leech to the system. What a bunch of bums. Okay, I'm being a bit harsh and probably ignoring some nuances here, but you can't ignore that 20% figure. That's something that society should have felt, and yet Icelandics barely did. Even in Australia, same thing happened. Protesters protesting and no effect on the economy. But I will say, how many places had to take on extra work so these banshees can waste a day? You know, your work colleague who you've abandoned, the real heroes. By the way, I wonder how many of them were males that had to pick up the slack. Give these boys a raise. In these situations, I was thinking about some kid who's learning to code their first video game, or perhaps picks up an instrument so he can form a band, doing the grind for some passion, with the hopes that it'll one day pay off. Reminds me of a story I heard about Pablo Picasso, that famous painter. He was at a cafe doodling on a piece of paper. Some lady asked if she could purchase the drawing. Mr. Picasso goes, 1 million francs. The lady was in shock as the drawing was sketched in a matter of minutes. The famous artist drops a truth bomb. "My dear, it took me a lifetime to be able to draw this sketch," he replied. "You see, some future champ is hard at work, self-developing, aiming ahead where others refuse to look up, and then you got these losers having a picnic, making TikToks on a device created and maintained by men, while all along pretending to be oppressed at a park that is once again maintained by the men they criticize. The privileged pretending to be oppressed. Power is something you personally can express without any other person's influence, like a boxer's. None of them is privileged in the ring, but one of them is more powerful. And it's the measurement of power, not privilege, that is the differentiating factor. Privilege, on the other hand, is power given to you by others and can even be unearned, hence why some chicks can hit a dude, knowing that if he hits back, he might be the one going to jail, not her. So next time, when you see these hairy armpits protesting about a non-issue, ask yourself, how is it that society is still functioning? You see, the type of person who protests these types of issues never resemble anyone you can inspire to be like. Well, as mentioned previously, you had heroes like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, or Gandhi the Gray, almost religious like figures that stood tall amongst the crowd, iconic in their vision and mindset. Their speeches are poetic and profound, blah, blah, what I said before. Now, take a look at today's protesters. Who's their hero? Greta Thunberg, a neurotic, autistic little girl with OCD, with probably a laundry list of additional mental health issues we don't know about. She kind of reminds me of a Teletubby. She was 15 when she started protesting. What world experience does she have? What was her resume? Hell, 5 years prior, she was a stinky kid doing what other stinky autistic kids were doing at the time, which was probably being bullied for being insufferable and playing with Lego, which, by the way, the amount of fossil fuel needed to create, produce, and deliver said Lego to her grubby, ignorant hands would have been astronomical. Bad girl, very bad. You get a smack. This is the kid protesters take their advice from. Let's have a look at today's heroes that either influence the current societal landscape or are a political powerhouse. You got people like Russell Brand, Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, and even less desirable people like Andrew Tate. I mean, I'm not much of an Andrew Tate fan, but I will say at times he will mention something insightful. You may not agree with everything a person says, but sometimes you can find a unique perspective you've never heard of. Also, I got to say, any person who complains about Andrew Tate being a misogynist but never says poo poo when feminists have signs like kill all men, you're an inconsistent dope. But anyway, why are these individuals so profound? Well, in the ocean of whales, I mean land of confusion, any person who speaks up and says any truth will be lambasted. But any person with enough intelligence, talent, skills, wealth, with a profound way to communicate their thoughts and ideas can draw attention and power to withstand the assault that they must endure. Not saying these people are the messiah or anything, but at least there's a bit of originality to their opinions compared to what the protesters are offering. For example, how many people started to clean their room because Kermit told them to, or hit the gym because Toe Rogan goes on about his gym, diet, and sauna routine. And that's the thing, be the change you want to see is far more influential than whinging about a cause that doesn't exist or wanting others to do the hard work instead of you actually solving the issue yourself. Like, check out this dude. This poor farmer legit spent 16 years studying law so he could sue a chemical company, and by the way, won. Now, I'm not saying everyone should pursue something this drastic, but what I am saying is to try and be tenacious. That is a sign of a character that is larger than life. Today's protesters are only larger than life when it comes to the body positivity movement. Are you starting to get my point? I'm talking about substance versus one's aesthetic, which, by the way, they have no sense of style. Like, what is that? Hence why they focus on appearance and get hung up on words, but not the meaning or intent behind them. For example, we can't use the word fat, so we must use the word plus size. But in a few years, plus size will be used as a slur, so a new word must be invented. Focusing on the aesthetics instead of the meaning behind the word is dangerous. You can change the type of cup you drink from, but the water inside remains the same. In other words, most protesters, especially ones in first world countries, are just that, all appearance with little substance. And guess what? People are noticing. Take Australia. They just had the voice vote. If you don't know what that is, the Australian government wanted to pass legislation for the creation of a branch of the government that gives a voice to the Aboriginal communities as a sort of advisory board for Indigenous matters. Now, guess what? All but one state in Australia voted no to the legislation. Keep in mind, the Yes team had a massive marketing budget of $450 million, plastered their campaign flyers all over the country. Large support from businesses and enforcement to comply in the workplace flooded the typical person's life. And of course, people wasting their day protesting and getting in the way as you try to go about your business. Another cause for contention was the constant threat of being called a racist if you vote no. Even Australian celebrities pressured everyone to vote yes, otherwise you're a bigot.
If you don't know, find out what you don't know. What that asinine slogan is saying is if you're a dinosaur, a dickhead, who can't be bothered reading, then vote no.
A side note, plenty of Aboriginals voted no as well. And for the no team, did they even have a budget? I feel like the money scraped together was found between couch cushions. Now, why did the yes team lose despite their heavy influence and budget? It's simple. The referendum was vague. How exactly was it going to operate? And that was one of many complaints. No one knew exactly what this entire thing entailed. No joke, the document was written on a birthday card or something. Even the Prime Minister, who's in support of the referendum, never read it. Really poorly thought out, if you ask me. And let's face it, the concept was primarily intended for lawyers and HR professionals to create jobs for themselves. They do so with the intention of enriching themselves while pretending to support a cause that is unlikely to have any significant impact. It's like how some charities give 10% to the needy but take 90% for administration and general running of the institution. Another reason for losing the yes vote was the fact that the campaign cost so much, and if it had won, millions would have been spent every year by the government, ultimately costing the Australian taxpayer a fortune for eternity. And boy, is the everyday Australian feeling the burn of inflation. Housing prices are ridiculous, some of the worst in the world. People are doing it tough. How about instead of virtue signaling, the government come up with some sort of solution for the everyday Australian who can't afford a house? And with the cost of living, how many Aussies will fall through the cracks? Basically, all that passion and money spent could have gone to the wider Australians to ease their stresses of living. Really, with darker times about to hit, especially after the money spent during the season of COVID, this is the big thing the government focuses on. Not to mention, Australia provides $30 billion plus to Indigenous causes every year. Some might argue that the money isn't doing a whole lot to actually help the Aboriginal people, but that's for someone who's more insightful to ponder. The other issue is the constant preaching and shaming. We've all been there. It's like you're working in a team. You sit next to Muhammad, hear absolutely nothing about the Quran. Mrs. Ming, on the other side of you, is too busy completing her spreadsheet to explain to you about her Buddhist statue sitting on her desk. We're all holding hands, maybe even having a makeout sesh. For most people, you don't really hear much about their religious or cultural beliefs. But then a wild libtard appears. The rules of the game have now been shifted. Be careful what you say. Don't disrespect the Don or HR might be knocking on your door. And what is this progressive going to say? Of course, he or she will need to bring up the magic topic, politics. Have you ever been around a libtard who has not brought up politics? Like, go deep into your mind, reach to the depth of your soul. Has there ever been a time their left-wing opinions were kept to themselves? Yeah, I thought so. For it is foretold, the nihilistic zealot shall not keep thy opinions to thyself. If the androgynous peasant, for a single moment, does not give one's opinions at work or civil functions, the beginning of the end shall commence, ushering the they-them end times. Yup, it's that group that must interfere and puke their opinions while everyone else rolls their eyes and moves on. Imagine having a Mormon street preacher sitting next to you. Well, a protester is that person, but not religious, and is trigger happy to go straight to HR for the smallest of infractions because they can't fight their battles on their own. And that's the thing. They don't get that their actions causes people to push away from their cause. Across the world, people are waking up. When you have a group of people that can't fix things but are really good at pointing their vegan fingers at subjective issues, prime example, the Just Stop Oil protesters and their hypocritical perspective, and not to mention the lack of understanding of what ramification their cause may provide, their lives would be infinitely worse if their wishes came true. And guess who they'd blame still? You guessed it. Society. I suppose the mind of a protester comes from relying on others and never being independent, wanting to be lazy, hoping to create a system where someone else does all the hard work while they leech off everyone. Kind of like a recreation of adolescence when you think about it. Just remember the video games you enjoy, the bands who write and perform their own music, the people who took the risk in starting their own business, or hell, the ones who create silly YouTube videos are rarely the type who go out protesting. They are too busy leveling up. It's easy to judge others. Shucks, I'm doing it right now. But actually, learning to be competent is hard. Go ahead, spend an entire month working on a single hard thing. Release that crappy song on Spotify. Learn to code, learn to animate, do something on your own that requires an immense amount of effort. And with all that said, if you're a protester, there's a high chance you're going to waste your time anyway, reaping very little reward because of your efforts. You'll go out there with your generic signs, and none of your demands will help society except force the cost of living to go higher. And then you'll continue to blame the system. It's like when companies replace plastic straws with paper ones, all for a greener future. Well, I guess we are happy to cut down more trees then. Basically, we switched our blinker on, merged from one destructive lane to another. But hey, we can pat ourselves on the back for shifting the issue towards another direction. Oh, here is my exit. Now, of course, I need to touch on one of the worst groups. You guessed it, Black Lives Matter, a movement run by Marxists who happen to rake in millions. Those sneaky commies always taking advantage of other people's labor. There's always a theme with this group of people. Preach one thing but live contradictory, kind of like Husan Piker, one of YouTube's biggest socialist, Marxist, communist, intersectional, feminist, progressive, furry. You get the drill. Labeling yourself is more important than acquiring skills, I see. A millionaire socialist. So I wonder why he doesn't use his wealth as a vehicle for societal transformation. By the way, I don't care about what you do with your money. I just don't like people with immense amount of wealth preaching for a solution when they have the capabilities to actually make a change. Protesting has become like the United Nation. Denounce something, then move on to the next fad. Look at the Russia versus Ukraine protests. I guess all those protesters forgot about the ongoing war. Off to the next gig, I suppose. Gee, I wonder why the war is still going. Maybe Western protesters need to protest more. Maybe they need to protest 5 times a day, like how Muslims pray 5 times a day. Now, for some real talk, coffee talk. There's plenty of things to fight for, but if you do not do the research as to why you are protesting, you are a fool. I mean, if you quiz these protesters, how many of them actually know enough to actively put a stake in the sand? Bet it all on a particular cause. If I cared enough about an issue before I ever go protesting, I would want to be pretty sure the cause is legitimate. The issue is that most protesters' level of knowledge of any matter is pretty poor. Basically, cliff notes of information. What do you expect when their education comes from protest signs? Again, I'm only talking about illegitimate protesting, not the legitimate ones. And ultimately, the driving force for a lot of these people is one of neuroticism and hatred for the other side. Take vegans, for example. Some will do it for moral or health reasons, but a lot will do it because they want to have the ability to judge and shame another group. In this case, meat eaters. Also, the need to feel morally superior plays a huge factor. And given the amount of protesters I've come across, I get a sense that these are covert narcissistic bullies who have found a way to look moral. They tend to be driven by insecurities, which they then project onto the world. Simply to round out everything, if you want to fight for something, be sure the effort you put into it has the same level of effort placed on understanding the subject. If the effort is at the same level as a typical protest sign, then maybe you need to spend more time informing yourself. And just as importantly, if you're a parent who brings their kid to one of these protests, oh boy, do I feel bad for that kid. That's called indoctrination. You see, if most protesters are pea brains on the subject, how can kids truly understand what's going on? I guarantee that kid is going to develop some kind of mental health issue. I mean, if they are being exposed to this way of living amongst a group with the highest level of mental illnesses, what other nonsense are they being exposed to? Lastly, don't do it for clout. It doesn't make you cool. My name is Depresso Expresso. If you like the content, please subscribe, like, and comment below. This is a new channel, and any type of support will help it grow.